all of us, I think, or at least most of us, have come in contact with the concept of Atlantis. This is something I grew up hearing about, and I've read lots of material about it. Not all of it, there is just endless and endless and endless amounts. I can't say I've necessarily even read the best things, but the general consensus that all the information starts to point to that one, Atlantis was either a large island or a continent. The majority of the information points to it being a large continent that exists, but a lot of it points towards being in the Atlantic somewhere. I know from listening to Bashar, who I trust as one of the more stronger sources of information, he says that Atlantis, or the remnants that you can discover of it, are primarily located in the region that we call the Caribbean islands. The idea of druids, the kind of spirituality and the more pagan spirituality that existed in England, Scotland, Ireland, around that area, is in some way represented of the new expression of the teachings that came from ancient Atlantis. Atlantis has a kind of partner story with another civilization that's known as Mu. This continent was called Lemuria. A lot of the information says that they existed at the same time, but almost all the information states that Lemuria, Mu, came earlier, and that it was a lot more of a positive society, and Atlantis was in many ways the mirroring primarily of America and what America has become. The purpose of making this video is to relate personal vision that Sarah, my guide, has shown me. There was a time where I was exploring a lot of dreams. It was like a kind of false pursuit at the point because I was a little bit too hungry for things, and she was showing me a lot of falsehoods. Mixed in with the falsehoods were real visions. One of the things she showed me that I thought at the time was in fact just a dream. It was two visions. I can't speak of the first one because I've never heard any stories about this, and I have no idea what it in fact symbolizes at all. But the only reason I reference it is because they were back to back, and they both had that enormously almost poetic, epic beauty to it, which is why I thought it was a gift. I thought it was a gift creation in a dream, because there was a lot of nightmares that I was experiencing at the time. But in the mix of all this stuff, there were these two experiences where I was like, whoa, that's so beautiful. And it reminded me of the kind of imagery you might see in fantasy stories. So the first vision was a vision of what looked like an ancient stone tower, and it was squared essentially, and it looked almost I don't know what you could say, a lighthouse, an ancient lighthouse. And the lighthouse was surrounded, I think, by water at the base, and then there were windows on the top. If you can picture movies like Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or something like that, anything that is rooted in that deep mythology with a very kind of old world fantasy, almost very romantic kind of expression of storytelling. In a lot of our lives, that kind of storytelling, it's enormously nourishing to us. It puts us in touch with a state of being that is extremely soothing and calming and beautiful. And it also speaks of a time where magic was more interwoven in the day-to-day expression and experience of our humanity, that you feel a kind of sense of spirituality, a kind of life sense of who you are, in a very stilling and soulful way. You also feel that passion, that incredible life juice that makes you feel alive. Well, at least I do when I watch those movies. It kind of triggers something very primal, but enormously human, in the truest sense of the word. I think that's just a common feeling people have. The reason I'm referencing that is because when I see these two visions, I feel like that when I'm looking at them, because they look like beautifully poetic in the way they express themselves. There's like enchantment and depth and richness to how it looked. The light even looked like more beautiful, like more fulfilling, more colorful. So like I said, this tower was the first thing I saw. On this tower, it looked like there was, it almost looked like it was like yellow pages. There was books that were lining the whole length of the tower all the way up to the windows up at the top. And the books were all kind of dirty, like they were just kind of flapping in the wind, and they looked kind of like yellowy the way the books were, and they were all kind of like on the tower all the way down, just below the windows at the top that were carved out of stone. Like it was very, very beautiful looking, like they'd put in like a lot of work. It was also very old and like almost like falling apart. I couldn't really see what was on any of the covers or anything like that. It was almost like someone was trying to make a statement, which is why I'm not sure if in fact it is like a dream. I reference it because it looks very similar to the scene right after it that I was shown, that I know is at least a representation of Atlantis. I have no idea what this means. I have no idea what it was for, or if it has anything to do with my life as just like a symbol or something like that. I don't know if anyone would recognize this symbol maybe out there, or anyone's familiar with that, or what it means. It could be some very simple explanation for all I know, but I know it preceded the next vision, because the next vision, I was up above the shoreline, looking out at, I'm not sure if it was a river or an ocean, I can't quite recall, but I know it was like a city on the edge of a shoreline. In the city, it was beautiful. Like I said, like the last vision, like it had this very kind of romantic, epic, adventurous storytelling kind of like visual to it. It looked incredibly beautiful, which is originally why I thought this was false, because if you're involved in the spiritual community, it's almost like someone just took like every like spiritual concept and then made a city out of that. Because what it looked like in the city, there were like reddish brown brick stone pyramids, like step pyramids are what I saw. Some of them were like that, but there were like different configurations, but there was more than one. There was like several versions of it. It was like a very dense kind of like city of those kinds of pyramids. There was a lot of like greenage too. There was a lot of like trees and foliage and bush and things like that too, but it was clearly like a very organized type city. I couldn't really get a look at anybody because it was so high above, like I was literally above like the earth, looking over this landscape. What I saw in the distance, as far as I can remember, was 2 to 3 air balloons. If you're familiar with the idea of steampunk, it's kind of similar to what's depicted in steampunk iconography. There's a lot of like again, like a very, almost like very elaborate, beautiful, like romantic, lavish kind of like representation of these air balloons. The idea that I have in my head is almost like a 1930s like fair with like air balloons, except these were air balloons people rode in. So they had kind of like brass fittings on them, like a brass framework. I can't remember the color so much. I think there was like reds maybe. To be honest, I can't quite remember. I just remember that the fittings and the way the design of it was like, it was very articulate and beautiful, like an artisan had crafted it. Not like how we would craft air balloons today, in a more like mathematical, very just basic kind of form. Like these were like works of art floating in the air. And they, like similar to what we would have today, there was an air balloon and there was kind of like a fitting underneath it that had room for passengers to basically stay there. And when you see the whole thing kind of like moving in like photographic reality, it is like a lavishly, exquisitely beautiful thing to look at. Like it was just like wow. Like this is like I felt grateful for seeing it, to be completely honest. The visual of it was enormously beautiful. What I thought I was seeing was like a construction, like a fantasy construction from Sarah. I thought she was showing me this as like a gift. Okay, so flash forward to this year. I'm watching a clip of Bashar talking about Atlantis. He's basically confirming everything I saw in that dream. And when I think back to it, I'm so surprised that that's what it looks like. Because he says that the people in Atlantis, they had pyramidal type architecture that was like exactly like what I saw. It was like red brick, reddish brownish brick, more in the Peruvian, like Mayan, Aztec, like kind of style of pyramids, which it exactly was. He said that the people were brown skinned, and he said that they used to float above the air in air balloons. And when he said that, my mind went back to that vision that I thought was just a fantasy. And then I was like, holy shit, that's Atlantis? Because just FYI, most of the stories I've heard of Atlantis, almost all of them talk about them being like a very technologically advanced society. But seeing this in visual representation, I'm like, well, it doesn't look like what I think technologically advanced is. When, as Sarah's saying, like when you say that, it's representative of how it translates through the channels who are experiencing that. Because in many senses, they are at the pinnacle of what like human advancement can be, and then fall into the dissension that now has expressed itself very, very technologically, mechanicalistically? Is that even a word? Mechanically, whatever. With very compartmentalized ideas of technology that essentially are drilling and sticking things together that are all just like many pieces, instead of recognize the oneness that is all in how you can interact and utilize the world in a natural frequency. There's no real necessity for the technological advancement unless there is a lack of like true wholeness in terms of how we experience and express ourselves as like unique individuals. So a lot of what's manifested in our world as technological advancement is I'm going to say this not from Sarah's perspective, but even from my own, it's almost like a lot of like handicap wheelchairs and crutches making up the difference of what our own personal development is lacking of onto ourselves. And so we have like experiences, expressions of things that like if you ever watched like Star Trek, The Next Generation, it's almost like the concept of the Borg. It's sort of like a half human, half robotic kind of society. Like not right now, but in many senses, like that's also rising up to meet the injury that has lasted from that time period. So a lot of the technology that we have is almost like making up the difference of where we've fallen as a species from that time period, from Atlantis and from earlier from Mu. There seems to be like a seed problem or something in the Lemurian society that then collapsed or was taken over. I'm not sure the entire story, but essentially it did collapse as well in on itself, and Atlantis became the dominant society at that time, and that inevitably met with a dire end. One of the things Bashar talks about is a rain of like asteroidal impacts that were basically like raining down for a long period of time, basically hailed down onto the Atlantean society and was part of some of the things that happened. There was also a tidal, like a tidal wave experience, or many tidal wave experiences that were all kind of in conjunction with one another, bringing about this basically just giant like apocalypse that lasted for a long period of time that shattered that society, and the remnants kind of went like every which way they could. I don't think it exactly broke into the sea. I think this is more like an element of the tidal wave kind of like claiming it, wiping it out, and then over time the rising of the sea levels on the planet for a number of different reasons, again, just basically like claimed that continent or whatever you might find today. There would just be like remnants, but a lot of it would have been like wiped out on the surface. So that isn't really the way that I was used to thinking of Atlantis. Like when I had ever thought of Atlantis, I had always pictured something with like almost like skyscrapers or technology of some recognizable sort. It was like very beautiful, and it seems like a lot more sophisticated and polished than you would find like in whatever remnants of like the ancient Peruvians now exist. But it was still at like a more balanced with nature kind of level. And the reason I want to talk about this is essentially to bring that up, is that our concept of what actual development is as a species would not necessarily approach what we would think like high level development would look like. Because if you look like at a city like New York, or a city like I don't know, like Los Angeles or Shanghai or something like that, or Paris or whatnot, you could say these are high level developments, right? And there is a lot of city like urban development. There's a lot of, you know, mechanical transportation that's moving around everywhere. The way Atlantis was back in the day was more in balance with the natural world. It was more like at a level that almost seems like primitive in certain senses. And it really gets me to think about this. It really gets me to consider what is the peak of human evolution? Like, where do we think we will go in our highest level experience of ourselves? Like, one of the things that Sarah has told me is that UFOs, like what we see as like the mechanical crafts that extraterrestrials inhabit, they're not so much like technology devices so much as they are life craft. If you see yourself as a citizen of the cosmos, for example, it could be like the idea of having an apartment in space. And so you'd have the various tools and whatnot to connect with the people that you enjoy living your life with. So they're more kind of like life craft than spacecraft. I thought that was a very interesting concept, because I'm used to thinking them in very technological ways. But even in those kind of like abduction stories or encounter stories or experiencer stories, there's lots of people who talk about technology in ways that is almost like magic, almost like wands versus like some kind of like computer technology. Not to say that they don't interact with computer technology, but the manner in which they express and develop those things is more in alignment with a higher level consciousness that is seemingly magic to our experience, especially having lived in a very mechanical, industrial, and now technological experience of humanity. It's very, very different, very, very different in many ways than our expression of like how we would create like aircraft. And that's why I want to explain that, because a lot of our own personal development in our core of core, like our emotional intelligence, like our physical development, like our mental, body, emotional harmony, our oneness with all those things, is literally the kind of development that needs to occur at this time in order for us to recognize what we can use in the technology of nature to actually assist us to live in a more simplistic way, rather than developing heavily mechanized, processed, separated versions of what we need for day-to-day living. So I just wanted to share that story. I thought it was like an interesting kind of experience. If you're familiar with that expression of a tower, please let me know in the comments down below. My name's Summer. If you love these videos, just hit the like button down below, and don't forget to subscribe, comment in the comment section, share, and let me know about your stories about Atlantis, because I know there's lots of information that people might have that haven't just been shared necessarily with everyone else. Well, that's my story, and have a great day, guys.